Marvel Superheroes is shaping up to be one of the least balanced formats ever printed. But is it the most imbalanced ever? I dug through 3 years of limited data, and I'm going to tell you just how the balance in this format stacks up, and how you can win anyways in the context of a highly imbalanced limited format. When we talk about imbalance, we usually mean that one color is way out on top or way below the others in terms of how often it is winning in draft and sealed. Today, I'm going to measure imbalance by comparing the top win rate and the bottom win rate, according to the free client 17lands.com, which provides public datasets on how often different color pairs have won in formats over the last several years. So thanks very much, 17lands, for the data. And here's what I found. This chart shows the difference between the worst performing color pair, which is the circle on the bottom of every bar, and the best performing color pair, the circle at the top of the bar, in a series of recent formats. It's actually every format over the last 3 years that was not a 3-color format or a 5-archetype format or otherwise wonky. These are 10 color pair formats where you can reasonably expect people to be playing one of the 2 color archetypes. The win rate is on the y-axis and the name of a set is on the x-axis. So for example, the most balanced archetype we have seen in the last 3 years is Final Fantasy, where the best color pair was winning, about 57% of the time, and the worst color pair was winning just under 54% of the time, for a 3 percentage point gap between the best color pair and the worst color pair. Other highly balanced formats you might remember include Avatar, Edge of Eternities, March of Machines, MTG Foundations. And the gap starts growing with sets like Aether Drift, Lost Caverns of Ixalan, even Duskmourn and Bloomburrow, where we're getting into 5, 6, 7 percentage point gaps between the best and the worst archetype. So what's behind this big black mass here? What is the rogues gallery of the most imbalanced formats? First up, we have Murders at Karlov Manor, where the best archetype was winning more than 60% of the time, and the worst archetype was winning less than 53% of the time. In order to facilitate a comparison with Marvel Superheroes, which is currently about a week old, all of these bars are a snapshot of the format after 1 week. So while MKM, for example, may have equilibrated to become more balanced over time, this is where things stood when we knew the format for only 7 days. Next up, and practically tied with MKM, is Phyrexia All Will Be One, and I think this is notable because both MKM and All Will Be One were formats where the archetype that started out in that first week as being completely dominant was a massively aggressive archetype. So that's one flavor of early set imbalance that we could be experiencing with Marvel Superheroes, where the aggro tools are just easier to assemble in the early format, and people have to learn how to make a good mid-range or control deck. Wilds of Eldraine, slightly different, not a archetype where an aggro deck was super fast out of the gate, but it was also extremely imbalanced at about 7.8 percentage point gap between the best and the worst. The third least balanced 10 archetype 2-color format of the last 3 years was Outlaws of Thunder Junction at nearly a 9 percentage point gap in the probability that you are going to win a game if you are playing the best archetype versus the worst archetype. Then, drumroll please, the second least balanced archetype of the last 3 years, Marvel Superheroes. It is basically tied with Outlaws of Thunder Junction, with blue-white Azorius absolutely bursting out of the gate in the #1 position, 9 percentage points better than black-red Rakdos. About a 60.1% chance that you're going to win your game if all I know about you is that you're a 17 lands user who is playing Azorius, and a 51% chance that you're going to win your game if you're a 17 lands user who is playing Rakdos. What was the least balanced set of the last 3 years? It was Lord of the Rings, with a full 11.1 percentage point gap between the best and the worst archetype. So now we know that Marvel Superheroes is the second least balanced draft format of the last 3 years. So where are we going to go for here? And how can you make sure that you are on the winning side as the format evolves over the next, let's say 2 months that it's with us, month and a half? To figure that out, I took those other 3 least balanced formats, starting with Lord of the Rings, then Outlaws of Thunder Junction and Wilds of Eldraine, and I charted how they evolved over the duration of time that we are going to have until mid to late August, when Marvel Superheroes transitions out and is replaced by The Hobbit. And my goal with this analysis is to help you win in this highly imbalanced environment by figuring out how imbalanced environments tend to evolve and how you can surf the wave of which archetypes are best at different moments. As with the rest of this analysis, this is very focused on Premier Draft online on Arena. So here was Lord of the Rings week 1, and I don't want you to focus too much on which color pair is ahead, more just on the distribution of color pairs. As you can see, this was actually black-red up on top, and it was a full more than 11 percentage points ahead of green-white down here on the bottom. And here is how things evolved over the course of the next roughly 2 months. So if you chart how Rakdos is moving with your eye, you can see that actually things did tighten up. By around 4 weeks into the format, and I'm comparing week over week, this is not a moving average. So this is what you would have experienced if you loaded up Arena in week 4 of the format. Rakdos was still definitely on top, but it was much more closely bunched to the other color pairs. If you compare it, there's sort of a top and a bottom half of the format. It had a lot to do with whether or not you were playing green, in fact. And if you were in this better half of the format, you were only experiencing, maybe a 3 percentage point gap between the best and the worst archetype. Not that different from a highly balanced format like, let's say, Final Fantasy. However, there was a much less balanced half where you were giving up a big gap in equity if you were in one of the worst performing archetypes. However, that was not the end of the story, because by the very end, when the format was as old as Marvel Superheroes will be when it rotates off of Arena, the gap had actually kind of reopened. So Rakdos was still way out on top. Green-white was still way out on the bottom. And if you had just been drafting Rakdos all the way along in this format, you would be pretty happy all the way along. So that's one way that an imbalanced format can evolve. There's a clear leader, it stays ahead of the pack, things tighten, but it ends up out on front in the end. All right, now how about Outlaws of Thunder Junction for another way that these things can evolve? So remember, OTJ had an almost identical amount of imbalance to Marvel Superheroes as of week 1. And here is how things looked in week 1 of that format. Yes, there was a clear leader way up on top, but at the same time, it was a little bit more closely bunched than Lord of the Rings was in week 1. And if we watch how things evolve over the course of that format, that green-white mounts deck that was the best deck to be playing on week 1, it actually does eventually, tab too far, it actually does eventually get overtaken. So there was an Orzhov deck, which had a kind of a sacrifice theme, which actually ended up being the best format as of not the last week of that format, but what the equivalent of what will be the last week of Marvel Superheroes, 2 months into the format. So this is a different way that things can evolve. What turned out to be the best deck by the equivalent of the end of this format was only the 3rd best deck at the start, and was not the best deck until the format was pretty darn mature. And what started out as very healthily the best deck ended up in basically a 3-way tie for second. So definitely not a clear leader all the way through. Basically, as people realized that green-white mounts was really good, they all started flooding to it, and by around a month and a half into the format, green-white mounts was not exactly overdrafted, but contested enough that it was not in clear first. Now, with OTJ, I also want to note just how consistently the floor rose, and I think there's a very specific story behind that, which is the green-white mounts deck was very obvious, but there was this Grixis control deck that involved this mechanic committing a crime with a bunch of cards that were kind of understated, maybe a little bit underpowered on their face, but intensely synergistic. It was really, really hard to figure out how to put them together into a deck. Everyone broadly knew what you were trying to do, but we were definitely getting better as a community week over week over week of putting together the Grixis control deck in that format. And I remember saying to my friends early in that format, I bet that there's going to be something there. We all thought there's something there in that Grixis space, but we didn't really know how to do it yet. So basically what you can clearly see in the data here is the community improving at building the archetype that we all knew we were broadly supposed to be building. So that's happening to the bottom and kind of condensing the format to make it a whole lot more balanced over time, while there's also some flux at the top where maybe some of the more straightforward decks to build were kind of jostling for first position. Okay, so we have version 1, Lord of the Rings. There's a beater. It just stays a beater the whole format. There's a really bad color that you just should avoid. Then we have version 2, Outlaws of Thunder Junction, where we all kind of know there's something that's best, and then we all kind of know there's something that's worst, but that thing that's worst has a lot of depth to it, and over the course of a few weeks, we can really figure out how to actually make it not that bad after all. Wilds of Eldraine was a third interesting story. So this format started out about as unbalanced as Outlaws of Thunder Junction or Marvel Superheroes in terms of the gap between first place and last place. But let me show you how it evolved. So over the course of the first few weeks of the format, there was a bundle of better decks on top that all kind of unbundled themselves and ended up pretty spread throughout the win rates at the end of 8 weeks. There was a bundle at the bottom that also kind of unbundled themselves. And then there was a clear worst place deck. Funny enough, that was actually Azorius in that format. And over the course of the format, that one archetype just got better and better and better until eventually it turned out the format was like pretty balanced, like 58% down to 53%, only a 5% gap. That would be one of the more balanced formats that we've had on week 1. Now, why did that deck get better? Because it started out as apparently, I believe, an enchantments theme. Wizards said this was supposed to be a deck about playing a bunch of enchantments. That like never is good in limited, really. But I believe there was a pro tour where people had figured out that there was some like tempo deck, a blue-white kind of flyers tempo that turned out to be really good. And then once people started drafting blue-white as though that was the point instead, it ended up absolutely joining the pack and not even being close to the worst archetype by the end of the format. So these are the 3 different trajectories that imbalanced formats take, at least that they have in recent years. In Lord of the Rings, you have a situation where there's kind of no hope. Black-red is just the best. Anything with green and maybe white is just the worst. And that's probably just not going to reverse over the course of the format. It was still an awesome format, by the way. There's no hope doesn't mean there's no hope to have fun. And that's a totally different discussion. But just talking about how to navigate balance to make sure that you're staying on the better side of that win rate curve. In OTJ, we had a situation, Outlaws of Thunder Junction, where we knew what the archetype was supposed to be. It was just really hard to figure out how to put the pieces together, and it took the community broadly several weeks for everyone to kind of catch up to what were the good cards, what were the bad cards, and what was the right game plan to make it happen. And then finally, in Wilds of Eldraine, we had to completely ignore what the worst deck was supposed to be doing and invent an archetype that actually would work with the cards that were printed in that color pair to turn it into a competitive way of drafting. So which one do I think Marvel Superheroes is? And how should that inform your approach to the format to make sure that you're winning drafts? As I get into answering that, let me say, if you're someone who likes using data to get better at limited, make sure that you're subscribed to my channel on YouTube. If you play Arena Directs, I actually just dropped a half hour of dense information about what is good in sealed in this format, Marvel Superheroes, to make you have the best chance possible of winning a box. I'm about to do the same for drafts, so I'm going to do a data deep dive, not just on whether the set is balanced or not, but actually on what specifically is going well, and maybe some overlooked cards or strategies. Also, basically every weekday, I put those data learnings into practice with positive-minded, growth mindset, gameplay videos of draft and sealed. So if that appeals to you, make sure that you're subscribed. All right, so which of these do we think Marvel Superheroes is? Well, let's look at what Lord of the Rings looked like by the equivalent of when Marvel Superheroes will rotate out. Basically, if you had just been jamming Rakdos all the way along, you would be very happy. So if Marvel Superheroes resembles Lord of the Rings in the way that its imbalance plays out, then just keep jamming Azorius, and all the way along, you'll probably just ride the win rate curve. Basically, in Lord of the Rings, the best archetype was never drafted enough that it stopped being the best archetype for a few days here and there. But broadly, if you just loaded Arena on a random day when Lord of the Rings was on Premier Draft and you just drafted Rakdos, you were putting yourself in the best position. Obviously, that doesn't mean you should force it at every table. If the person next to you is drafting Rakdos, that's going to affect your win rate. But knowing nothing else about what you're doing, you should have a strong preference to be drafting black-red at any point in Lord of the Rings and a strong preference against drafting green-white. So if you think Marvel resembles Lord of the Rings in that regard, you should draft not forcing Azorius, but with a preference to keep jamming Azorius. What about Outlaws of Thunder Junction? It told a different story, right? The format did become more balanced over time, more consistently so than Lord of the Rings. And the worst performing color kind of 3 colors ended up getting substantially better. What ended up being the best thing to do in Outlaws of Thunder Junction was actually the 3rd best color pair in the early format, and the worst colors were not that bad. So basically, experimenting with one of the other top colors would have been a pretty good strategy in Outlaws of Thunder Junction, because you would have been prepared to ride the curve of some of these other alternate strong archetypes getting better and better over time. So if you think that Marvel is more like Outlaws of Thunder Junction, you should especially try experimenting with archetypes that are maybe like the 2nd best, 3rd best, 4th best things to be doing right now. Those would be mainly like Selesnya, which is a few percentage points lower at this point than Azorius is, and Simic, which is like right below that. So green-white, green-blue, you should play around with taking, instead of a blue-white deck, maybe pair one of those colors with green instead. All right, and what about Wilds of Eldraine? A type of an environment where, first of all, things started out a whole lot more bunched together. If you compare this bunching with what we saw in Lord of the Rings, where you had one way out on top, one way out on bottom, and then not very coherent groupings within the rest of them, WoW was a situation where basically any of the top bunch would have been fine, and then also any of the middle bunch would have been fine. And then actually also experimenting with the bottom one would have been fine if you're okay being one of those people who was bleeding out gems this whole time in order to just figure out how to do that blue-white Flyers tempo deck that turned out to be the actual best archetype here. So in the context of Wilds of Eldraine, okay, maybe you don't want to be one of those bold people on the frontier losing a lot of games with blue-white to figure out how to make it work, but basically anything else would have been perfectly fine. If you loaded into Arena on, let's say, week 4 of the format, you would have found that basically anything except blue-white was not that super distinguishable, like a 3 or 4 percentage point gap between all the other 9 color pairs. So if you think that Marvel Superheroes more closely resembles WoW, where we're going to have to figure out something fundamentally new about how to play black-red, but if we do, then we can start maybe winning more with it, then experimenting broadly is probably worth doing. So which one do I think that this format is? Well, let's look at the data so far for Marvel Superheroes. I'm not going to plot it because 17 Lands actually has a moratorium on providing third-party visualizations of their data for the first few weeks of the format. So I'm absolutely going to respect that, of course. But let's just look at what the color pair win rates look like right now on 17 Lands for Marvel Superheroes Premier Draft. So the top color pair is Azorius, 60.1% win rate. Second highest color pair is Selesnya, 57.7% win rate. And by the way, number 3 is still a full percentage point below that, Simic, with a 56.7% win rate. So basically you have a situation where there's a big gap between number 1 and number 2, and then still a pretty meaningful gap between number 2 and number 3. And number 4 is like number 10 is way out there on the bottom, a full 2 percentage points below numbers 9 and number 8. So basically, number 1, big gap, a bunch of archetypes, big gap, number 10. That kind of sounds like Lord of the Rings. Number 1, a big gap, a bunch of archetypes, a big gap, and number 10. Maybe it sounds kind of like OTJ, but I would say these gaps are maybe a little bit more evenly spread along the distribution. And number 1 did fall pretty quickly from week 1. And it does not at all sound like Wilds of Eldraine, where you basically just had a cluster, then another cluster, then an outlier on the bottom. So between these 3, I would say it closely resembles LTR, semi-resembles OTJ, doesn't really resemble Wilds of Eldraine. So my suggestion is that if you want to win in this format, you should just have a preference towards drafting Azorius all the way through. My read on the card file is that the way that these big gaps emerge is when you have like one or two strong colors, one or two notably weak colors, and putting them together makes them extra great or extra terrible. They're goodness compounds or they're badness compounds. With Lord of the Rings, black was super strong, red was super strong. You put them together and it was amazing. But blue-red was really good too, for example, in Lord of the Rings, with a completely different game plan. And green was terrible, white was terrible. You put them together and they're extra terrible. Reading through the card file now with like the knowledge of how the first week of the format has played out, I feel like Marvel Superheroes is more in that boat where there's just fundamentally so many strong blue and white commons and uncommons, especially, that putting them together is just fundamentally hard to overtake. If everyone had perfect information at all times, I roughly believe that games would end up being pretty balanced. All of the archetypes would converge to an equal win rate. But that's not how the broad community works. That's not how the player base works. It's a good thing that our game includes a lot of people who will just never look at a data video like this, hop into an arena draft and just do whatever. Whatever looks good to them in the moment. That's good. That's awesome. You shouldn't have to spend, 40 hours a week on Magic to be able to play it, obviously, right? But because there's that breadth in the community, that means that not everyone is going to be super clued in that Azorius is the thing to be doing. And I'm guessing that the strength of the imbalance in this format is going to outweigh the capacity of the community to adjust to and adapt to that strength. That's just my guess. So I'm going to be drafting with a preference towards Azorius throughout the format. Although having said that, I'm going to keep an eye on the data and see how it actually does develop. So let me know what you think. I'm going to put a video in the comments where I talk a lot more about how and why I use 17 land data and what all these numbers mean if you're interested in more information about that. And of course, you should also go to 17lanes.com. And I'm going to be back in the next few days jamming a few arena directs of this format. And then, like I say, another data video about how drafts are best navigated in Marvel Superheroes according to the data. So until tomorrow, have tons of fun playing Magic and don't be afraid to splash.